I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. In this episode, since entering the public sphere in 2016, Brexit has been an issue shaped by, and at the whims of, media coverage. Contents of that coverage has morphed over the last 3 years as specific terminology, personalities and deadlines have arisen, and media discussion of today's Brexit news is very different from that prior to the referendum. Beyond the ideology and policy in any article or broadcast, the linguistic nuance of coverage has also been in a state of flux. New slogans, phrases and even individual words have been coined, risen to common use and then dropped off in popularity throughout the Brexit debate and subsequent negotiations. Dr. Andreas Bracchi, Cardiff University, has monitored and assessed the ebb and flow of phrases in British media discussing Brexit and is talking with us today about the emergence and lasting use of specific language therein.
I'm a senior lecturer at the Centre for Language and Communication Research here in Cardiff, which is within the School of English Communication and Philosophy. I came to Cardiff originally in 2013 as a postdoc, so this was about a year after I'd finished my PhD, to work on a particular project with one of my colleagues here now, Alison Ray, who's an expert in formulaic language and phraseology. Eventually I ended up as a senior lecturer.
And the topic that we're going to be discussing today was something that came up at a recent conference presentation.
Exactly.
You could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. So earlier in the summer, we had the international conference that sort of is a biannual thing. It's called Corpus Linguistics. And really, it's a focal point for researchers into language that use what's called linguistic corpora. So these are large collections of texts. So there could be spoken texts or written texts. So it's really a methodology, as it were, a way of studying the language that unites all of those perspectives of those people who attend this type of conference. You know, it's a method, but also you get certain types of insight that you might not get in other ways. So I presented a paper entitled Brexit Phraseology.
The English language, from my understanding, is notable for being as malleable and quick-changing as it is, and Brexit being a comparatively recent event, how much time does it take for an event to really impact language?
This is a really interesting question because it's one of the questions that prompted me to look into this. I did some research earlier about language change over relatively short periods. Typically in historical linguistics, we look at language change over hundreds of years, and so say syntactic change, so the change in grammatical structures is thought to take place very slowly. So if you read a text from, say, a decade or even 50 years ago, in terms of the syntactic structure, you might not notice much of a difference. You really have to go back to a much earlier stage of the language to notice any differences in that regard. And so people have generally thought, based on this, that language change is something that takes a very long time, that you can't observe really. You can only in retrospect, by going, as I say, across hundreds of years, can you actually see what's changed. But with my own research focused on phraseology and what we might call formulaic language, I've seen that in that area, things, at least in that area, I think probably in other areas as well, if you look at it carefully, things do seem to be changing much more rapidly. Perhaps worth saying a few things about what phraseology might be. So,
please.
Phraseology is really the sort of common phrases or the common turns of phrasing that we find in language. So you might have idioms there. So get to hang off something is an idiom, or proverbs. Things like rubbish in, rubbish out is a type of proverb that you sometimes hear. And then there are more mundane turns of phrase, things like with respect to something is a kind of little formula that people use, or even things like open letter, which is really two words, but it's almost like a term, that has a particular meaning. It's not a letter that's open, but
it's its own idea.
Precisely. And or you have words that attract each other and go well together. So, for example, utter disgrace. That is a sort of people
no
tend to slip into these words.
It's always complete disgrace, absolute 100%.
Yes. So people tend to slip into those types of phrases. So this is the type of thing I'm looking at. And as I say, so based on previous research, I found that some of these types of things tend to change much more rapidly than we might think. And also, they seem to be linked to what happens within a society at a certain time. And so, of course, with Brexit, it is something that affects a lot of people. Society is, I think it's probably not overstating it by saying, is somewhat in turmoil because of this. Mm-hmm. So you would think that we should probably, if we look at the language at that time, we should probably see some kind of reaction within the language. So it's interesting from the one side to look at Brexit phraseology as a way into the question, can we actually detect language change as it changes, and and how might that happen, and etc. So that's sort of asking questions about language. The other thing that I think is interesting to get to when we look at Brexit phraseology is, what does society think about this topic? You can get at that as well.
I had been wondering, when you mentioned the multi-word phrases and utter disgrace, open letter, how much that relates to the use of slogans and catchphrases, yes, which there's a lot of in modern language and modern society, and definitely around the Brexit debate and then referendum, and then I guess marketing and policy since has been kind of dictated sometimes by what is a catchy phrase, what have we heard from politicians or policymakers most in the news, and how is that shaping the debate of the idea and the topic of Brexit?
That's correct. So it's interesting to see that there are both those types of phrases that, as you say, are sort of catchphrases that we rather suspect are deliberate coining. So there may be communication advisors who sort of say, oh well, let's make this a catchy phrase or a catchy expression and hope that it catches on, and then that will hopefully sort of give the message a particular drift, as it were. So there is that, but there are also phrases that come into existence via sort of more less deliberate ways, as it were, because
kind of organic.
Precisely, because you need, if you have a new phenomenon within society such as Brexit, then and people wish to talk about those, then that there have to be ways of talking about it. Now, language is very flexible, so we can talk about a lot of new things. But once you start talking about new things, what tends to happen is that there are certain ways of saying these things that sort of become slightly entrenched, that become the usual ways of putting a particular message or a particular thing that you want to say in relation to a topic. And this is where it becomes interesting, because then you get the sort of conventionalization that kicks in, which is no longer a thing that is simply an individual expressing him or herself, but is now something that becomes a communal thing, because everyone shares in that way of putting things. And this is, of course, also where, even though we might have these catchphrases or these deliberate coinings, some of them do enter the larger use, but others don't. And so, if it does enter general usage in topical area and language in general, then it becomes something that we're very interested in.
I wonder if we just go over the methodology of what data went into this analysis.
Yes. So for this particular paper, I looked at corpus data, since I'm a corpus linguist. So I looked at press reportings, and this includes newspapers, radio broadcasts, etc. And I made two different corpora, so collections of texts. Both of them ran from the date of the referendum to the end of last year, because that's when I prepared the paper. And one of the collection was articles or news items that included the word Brexit, and others items that did not include the word Brexit. So from that, I wanted to contrast those two in terms of those turns, those usual phrasings, as it were. So I extracted those usual phrasings, and there are procedures to do that. It has to do with how frequently does a certain expression occur, I extracted those from each of those two corpora, and then I compared those. So basically looking at the list of those common expressions on the Brexit topic, contrasting it with articles not on Brexit, you can then get to a list of those expressions that are only found in those texts that are on the topic of Brexit, or within which Brexit is at least mentioned. So that is roughly speaking, is the methodology. So the important thing here is perhaps that I like to approach it in a way that is, in a sense, quite comprehensive, rather than just going for perhaps the more obvious things. It's interesting to see to what extent the things that we might perceive from, listening to the radio or reading the paper, whether those actually show up in the data as well, and some of them did. But it's also interesting to see whether there might be perhaps some phrases that have gone, as it were, under the radar, but are just as much part of Brexit phraseology, as it were.
So there's going to be some headline phrases that people will probably be able to think of just from regular coverage, like second referendum, hard border, meaningful vote. These are things that you mentioned Brexit, and in the thought cloud in people's head, these are going to be attached phrases that get strung to pretty quickly.
Precisely, yeah. So these have shown up in the list, and that's reassuring in a way, because it shows, this is doing what it's meant to do. So that's good. But then there were lots of other phrases as well, and the interesting thing was it wasn't just those phrases that were fully lexically specific, so with a particular sequence of words, but there are also some that are perhaps more patterns, where they are much more flexible, but they still sort of follow a pattern. So you might have things like post-Brexit, is a kind of expression, but that's part of a wider pattern that some of these expressions go with things like in the post-Brexit world, in post-Brexit Britain, in the post-Brexit future. And, you can see all of these things emerging from that, or so-and-so has warned of something or other, or the warning that Brexit could, etc., etc. Yeah? So you see all of these types of patterns emerging from that, which are possibly not necessarily what we first think of when we think about, expressions bound up with Brexit.
And there's a few that you mentioned there of post-Brexit Britain, of in a post-Brexit future, that come up with something that is mentioned later on in your presentation about it being an epoch-defining event. Time will be bound as pre-Brexit and post-Brexit.
Well, possibly, because one of the questions you see when you look at topical phraseology and topical expressions in this way, there are always people who say, well, look, this has absolutely nothing to do with language itself. This has only to do with things that happen. So you might get these expressions and, they're sort of here one day and gone the next. They're not part of language in any proper sense. So there may be expressions like that, who are very topical, but there may be expressions that may stay with us for quite some time. And the one you mentioned is one of those. So even now in the language, when you look at a corpus, one of the expressions that we have is things like after the war or following World War II. Yeah? So World War II is a long way away now, but it was a cataclysmic event, as it were. So it seems to me that, without wanting to draw too close parallels, but
because we're talking about language, not ideology here. We're making that very clear.
But simply in terms of the magnitude of the societal impact, it seems to me that Brexit could be on sufficient enough a scale that those types of expressions might well stay with us, sort of those epoch type things, so following Brexit or in the post-Brexit era or what have you, that we can already see in the data now. That would be my prediction, possibly, that these expressions would stay with us, I don't know, in 50 or more years. They will still be part of the language. So it's not a case that these are just simply topical things that are here one day and gone the next, necessarily.
And you mentioned being on the lookout for any unexpected or any emerging phrases that you didn't think might have been something that people were necessarily expecting to be incorporated in the language in that way. Were there any phrases that you were surprised to see making up a large part of the coverage of Brexit?
To some extent, yes. The first thing that you notice, and this, although this is something that people might have picked up, generally in corpus linguistics, what we can see is that actual idioms, or even things like proverbs, are very, very rare in actual language use. So a lot of people know these proverbs, although knowledge does differ quite a lot between people. But when we look at, actual language being produced, these are very, very rare. Mm-hmm. And if they occur, they usually occur just in allusion to it. There are very few people who say when it rains, it's raining cats and dogs. There are very few people who actually use that idiom. But interestingly, in the Brexit discourse as well, the Brexit phraseology, some of these idioms that are so rare usually have actually come right to the surface. There's the thing about having cake and eating it. Mm-hmm. That's been so prominent. Or cherrypicking is another one of those. That are idioms that are not new to Brexit, but they are such that, usually we would never expect such a frequency. But yes, we see them, shoot right up in frequency in the context of Brexit. So that wasn't necessarily an expected thing. Another thing that has struck me somewhat are the number of expressions that there are patterns around expressing uncertainty. So another phrase that is very, very common is the uncertainty surrounding. And then you have these patterns. So the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, obviously itself, but also the uncertainty surrounding the status of EU nationals, the uncertainty surrounding the UK's future relationship with so-and-so. And, there's endless patterns there you can make.
How many times have we heard of companies changing their practice or closing because of the uncertainty surrounding Brexit? Or
Exactly. So these types of things become very useful linguistic tools because, if I say the uncertainty surrounding so-and-so or the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, then, this, as you say, is a phrase we hear all the time. And so it's very easy to understand. We know exactly what is meant. We can sort of mentally put it in a drawer and, this is what the person is saying. And this is what phraseology does. It helps us to communicate better in the sense that, we help mutual understanding by using those phrases that we sort of have an idea of what they are meant to communicate and what sort of concepts surround them.
I wonder if there's something to be said for some of the phrases you mentioned there of having cake and eating it, cherry picking. Yep. That so many people who are hearing this phrase and possibly using this phrase are trying to make some sense in their own way of a very complex situation. Like you wouldn't talk about the selective renegotiation of an EU backstop or the movement of EU nationals, but you could say cherry picking parts of this, that, the other, and it makes sense for the general public in a way, for the people who aren't involved in negotiations, but they get to conceptualize a very complex thing in a very small, manageable package of information, of words.
Yes.
And that is something that, do you think, is going to affect the way that people have conversations about Brexit, that you can possibly break things down into too small a chunk or too simple an idea?
What we can see in some of these phrases is that they're not, perhaps, we might say, ideologically neutral. Mm-hmm. So there are phrases that have certain conceptualizations that go along with them. So, if you're talking about cherry picking, then you are, by doing so, automatically implying that cherry picking is not a thing to do, is a legitimate thing to do. Yeah. Whereas you could possibly conceptualize the idea of that in a different way. So you might say, oh, I have no idea, but you would have to find a way to express it. But once there is, you see, a conventionalized way of putting this idea across, it's very, very difficult to avoid using that phrase. But it has, the conceptualization around it. There are others like this. So, for example, you might have something like the cliff edge. So this shows up in the data. So the cliff edge is there, but avoiding the cliff edge or going over the cliff edge or what have you. And in fact, if you look at political cartoons, the cliff edge features very prominently. Is usually the White Cliffs of Dover, but it is there. And of course, as soon as you use this phrase, the cliff edge, or going over the cliff edge, or avoiding the cliff edge, you are, in a sense, asserting that there is a cliff edge, and it's quite a dramatic thing if you think about it, because
nothing good is at the bottom of a cliff.
Well, precisely, it activates a whole load of other things. Yeah, so it implies immediately, that it's a catastrophe of some sort. So if you want to talk about a rupture or a transition that isn't smooth, then the cliff edge is kind of the phrase that has come to be used to communicate that. But if you were to be of the persuasion that, this is really nothing to worry about, etc., which some people interestingly are, then you can say, oh, there is no cliff edge. But even if you say there is no cliff edge, there you are. There's the picture of the cliff edge.
You've used the words cliff edge.
Precisely. So you end up reinforcing that still. Another example might be the idea that there's lots of phraseology around things like the best possible deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. No deal, of course, is now a thing. Whereas that is not necessarily the only way to talk about this type of thing. So the European phraseology is the withdrawal agreement, which is much more precise because, of course, there's going to be another agreement, after the withdrawal, etc. But in the data, the withdrawal agreement is not really used very much. So it's always the deal. So no deal, the best possible deal, etc. So if you think about an agreement and a deal, there are different sorts of concepts that are attached, or information and conceptualizations that are attached to these. So an agreement is sort of a very mutual thing where two parties perhaps sit down and sort out their differences and they come to an agreement. Exactly. Whereas a deal, it seems to me that a deal is about, getting the best for yourself and almost sort of trying to push the other person to accept something that may not be so good for them, but is good for you.
Yeah.
And
very mercantile, very
exactly
almost aggressive.
Yeah. And so it's difficult now, even for people who wouldn't perhaps agree with this type of conceptualization of a withdrawal agreement in this case, not to use this phraseology of talking about no deal or good deal or, what have you, a good deal for Britain and, all the rest of it. It's very difficult to get away from that because we, within this short period now that we've had to talk about Brexit, this has already formed into a convention that people use.
And you mentioned that this was going up until the end of 2018?
Yeah, so the data were only up to then for the moment. Yeah.
I was about to say, are there any plans for further analysis from 2019 potentially onwards, depending on how things turn out politically?
Yes, I would like to do further work on this, and I've already started on that. So one of the things that would be interesting to see is, we have different phases of this Brexit saga. So we might have the time before the referendum, so we might have the campaigning period, or even before the campaigning started when it became clear that there was going to be a referendum. So that might be one period. And then you have another period, between the actual referendum to when Article 50 was triggered. You can see I'm saying Article 50 was triggered, which is another one of those little phrases. Yeah, you could. There's other possibilities to say that. So we might say, invoke Article 50, but it's trigger. It's a bit
that's the word. That's the phrase.
Exactly. So we're almost bound to use that. So there are these different periods, and as you say, who knows what will happen on the 31st of October? But there's probably going to be another phase of Brexit after that.
Who knows how many prime ministers will have been through by the time this whole thing is done.
That's right. And so one of the things I'm hoping to look at is also, do different phases of Brexit have each their own phraseology, as it were? So if we look at some of the phraseology that's in the data, some of it already seems a little bit dated. So, for example, Brexit means Brexit was one of those slogans.
Fond memory at this point.
Well, it does already have the feel of being antiquated, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that does have that feel as belonging to an earlier period of Brexit. But what we know from phraseological research is also that sometimes these originally start as quotations. I mean, this particular one is a quote attributed to Theresa May. So sometimes what happens is that these quotes sort of develop a life of their own. Yeah, we call them winged words. Yeah, that sort of stay with us, but maybe become something completely no longer connected to that particular context in which they first were coined. So there is that possibility. And then there are other ones of those that we really feel are tied to particular periods. No deal is better than a bad deal. When I wrote this paper, it looked like, that had been consigned to an earlier period. Now it may be making a comeback now, but yeah.
Recording this in mid-August of 2019, so for anyone listening to this, just for posterity's sake, that's where this fits.
Precisely, yeah. So it's sort of come back. So talking about society and the types of things that society is going through, I think the phraseology, as we've seen, is almost like a barometer where we can feel the types of things that are going on within a society at a particular time. But they're also interesting because they tell us about how language functions and how it changes. So there are these two sides to it, which I find fascinating.
And if people do want to follow your work and keep up to date with your research, what would be the best way for them to keep track of that?
I think it would probably be to just look me up on Google, and that will, there are other search engines available, nicer ones, and that will direct them to my personal homepage here at Cardiff Uni. So I have a list of publications, and people are very welcome to follow up on any of those. And if any of those are not accessible, I try to publish in open access journals, but it's not always possible. So if someone were interested in a paper that isn't accessible, just drop me an email and I'll send you a copy. There's no need to pay for that.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.